I am going to tell you what I found on the Renfro property in Pope County, Illinois. And I am going to tell it the way I would write it in a duty log, which is the only way I know how to tell it. I have been a law enforcement officer with the U.S. Forest Service since 2004, 18 years by the time any of this started. And in that time, I have investigated things that did not have tidy explanations at the beginning. Illegal grow operations hidden in creek hollows. Night hunters running spotlights through federal timber at 2 in the morning. Illegal dump sites in ravines 15 miles from the nearest road. Most of those things, if you work them long enough, eventually make sense. A person put them there. A person had a reason. The reason was usually obvious once you found the right piece. This one has not made sense. I am still working it. I grew up in Carmi, in White County, about 45 minutes northeast of my current patrol area. Southern Illinois is not what people picture when they think of Illinois. No flat ground and corn as far as the eye can reach. Down here you have ridgelines and creek hollows and second-growth oak hickory forest dense enough to block cell signal in August. My family goes back 5 generations in White County. When I was 12, my grandfather drove me out to see the rock formations at Garden of the Gods, and I stood on top of Camel Rock and looked southeast over the Shawnee timber, and I thought that whatever else I did with my life, I was not going to leave this part of the country. That was 1985. I am still here. My assignment is out of the Harrisburg office in Saline County, where the forest supervisor keeps the primary Shawnee National Forest staff. My patrol area runs south into Pope and Hardin counties, along the Ohio River corridor, and across the forest boundary into the private lands that press up against the federal timber on every side. Pope County is the least populated county in Illinois, about 4,000 people in a space bigger than the city of Chicago. The county seat is Golconda, a river town on the Ohio. There is one stoplight in the county. I have been living in Elizabethtown, about 12 miles west of Golconda along the River Road, for 11 years. I know these roads. I know the timber. I know whose fence lines abut the national forest boundary and what they use those back acres for. I tell you all of this so you understand that I am not an excitable person. I am a federal law enforcement officer who has spent 18 years in one of the most rural and least trafficked corners of the continental United States. And the things that have rattled me in that time are very few. I have found a human body in the Lusk Creek drainage that had been there long enough to be skeletal, which is a particular kind of rattle. I have responded to a domestic incident in the Hardin County river bottoms that I still think about sometimes. I have driven up on a grow site where the operators were present and armed, and I have handled that the way training and sense dictate. All of these things shook something loose in me for a period, and then settled back in the way hard experiences do when you have enough of them. What I am about to describe is on the list of things that have not fully settled. The Renfro property sits at the end of a county gravel road called Hicks Branch Road, which runs along the Pope and Hardin County line south of the National Forest boundary. 120 acres, a mix of old crop ground and pasture, and a woodlot that bleeds into the Shawnee timber on its west and north sides. Harold Renfro worked that ground for 40 years, corn and soybeans first and then a small beef cattle operation in his later years. He passed in March of 2019 with no children and a nephew in St. Louis, who is a financial advisor and has never farmed a day in his life. The property went into probate through an attorney in Golconda named Gloria Marsh, and by the fall of 2022 it had been sitting idle for 3 seasons. The farmhouse was padlocked. The equipment had been sold off. The ground had gone back to weeds and volunteer corn, and the edge of the forest was starting to creep in along the west fence. There is a grain silo on the property. I need to describe it carefully because the silo is the center of everything that follows. Harvestor is a proprietary name, like Scotch tape or Kleenex. And if you grow up around agriculture in the Midwest, you know it immediately. Harvestors were manufactured beginning in the 1960s by a company out of DeKalb, Illinois, and they were common across the farming belt through the 70s and into the 80s. The construction is glass fused to steel panels bolted together in a vertical cylinder, smooth exterior surface with vertical seam rails where the panels join. The color is the thing that marks them. A deep greenish navy blue, a proprietary shade that the company marketed as its signature. You can drive through any county in rural Illinois and spot a harvestor from half a mile away by that color. The Renfro silo was built in 1974, according to the county assessor records I pulled later. 14 feet in diameter, 38 feet tall. By 2022, the color had faded from 50 years of central and southern Illinois weather to a dusty slate blue, but the profile was unmistakable. An exterior ladder ran up the south face with a safety cage beginning at about 15 feet and continuing to the top. The top hatch, used for maintenance and inspection, was hinged and open to one side. Harold had used the silo to store high-moisture corn in the 70s and 80s, then switched to haylage in the later years when he moved to cattle. He had told someone at the Elizabethtown feed store, the owner of which told me this later, that the bottom unloader mechanism had seized around 2011 and he had not fixed it because he was not sure the repair was worth it at his age. By the time he died, the silo had been empty for years. The base door was a sheet metal panel that sealed shut when the unloader corroded in place. The top hatch was accessible only from the exterior ladder. The reason I had a camera positioned on the Renfro fence line in the first place was a spotlighting complaint. A turkey hunter named Bill Haskins, who leases ground on the state game land just south of the Renfro property, called the Harrisburg office in September of 2022 to report vehicle lights moving through the National Forest timber after midnight, 3 nights running. I pulled a cutback attack IR I had set 400 yards south of the Renfro line, found nothing on it relevant to the complaint, and decided to move it north to cover a gap in the fence where the county gravel road crosses through. That gap was a natural deer pinch point, and I figured I would give the district wildlife biologist some October deer data while I worked Haskins's complaint. I remounted the camera on October 4th and planned to check it in 3 weeks. The cutback attack IR is a camera I had been using for a few years by that point. 6 AA batteries, fast trigger, 10 megapixel resolution, burst mode that fires a sequence of frames over 5 seconds when the passive infrared sensor triggers. The IR illuminator on it reaches about 80 feet in complete darkness, with usable detail out to 60 feet in my experience. I mounted it to a black oak 4 feet off the ground, aimed northeast at the gap in the fence, with the county gravel road visible behind the gap, and the Renfro pasture extending into the background for 200 feet. The harvestor silo sat about 160 feet northeast of the camera position, near the old dairy barn foundation. It appeared in the upper right of the camera's frame, in the background, sharp enough at that range to read but not the focus of the image. I was aiming at the deer gap. The silo was just scenery. I checked the camera on October 26th. A Tuesday morning, overcast, high around 55 degrees. I pulled the card and sat in my truck on Hicks Branch Road to review it on my laptop before heading back to the office. 412 images on the card, which was above average for that site. I went through them the way I always do, noting deer counts, looking for spotlighter IR flare in the tree line, logging anything unusual. The first 200 images were what I expected. Dozen yearlings at the fence gap, mostly in the pre-dawn and dusk windows. 1 small 8-point buck on October 8th, a turkey flock crossing at last light on the 14th, a coyote, a red fox, a opossum working the fence row. 1 vehicle on the road at 1:17 a.m. on October 16th, which I noted but cross-referenced with the spotlighting complaint, and ruled out because the headlight angle was wrong for someone working the timber and more consistent with a night shift worker coming home from the hospital in Harrisburg. Image 217 was timestamped 5:43 a.m. on October 12th. Nothing was at the fence gap. Whatever triggered the sensor was probably a deer that had cleared the frame before the camera processed the motion, or possibly a wind gust in the black oak branches. The camera fired anyway, the way they do, and the frame was empty fence line. In the background, at 160 feet, something was at the top of the harvestor silo. The burst captured 8 frames in 5 seconds. In the first frame, the top hatch was open, or appeared to be open, and there was a shape at the rim, dark, compact at the edges, visible against the pre-dawn sky. In frames 2 through 5, the shape moved. It came over the edge of the hatch rim and began descending the exterior of the silo on the south side, toward the exterior ladder. In frames 6, 7, and 8, it had moved below the top of the safety cage, about 8 to 10 feet below the rim, and was continuing down. By frame 8, it was far enough along the exterior to be past the range where the IR had enough detail to give me anything useful. I watched the sequence 3 times. My first read was simple and straightforward. Somebody was trespassing on the Renfro property and had been sleeping in the silo. Vagrant, most likely. Maybe an urban explorer, though the silo was not a structure that attracted that crowd. Or someone moving through the area on foot, river bottom population, a transient presence that moves through the Ohio River corridor and occasionally beds down in an abandoned structure when they find one. The silo being empty and locked at the base made it a reasonable shelter from the weather if you did not mind heights and were capable of climbing a safety-caged exterior ladder in the dark. I called the Pope County Sheriff's Office that morning and talked to a deputy named Roy Beckett, who patrols the north end of the county and knows the Renfro place. I described what I had, gave him the timestamp, told him I thought someone was camping in the silo. He said he would drive out. 2 hours later, Beckett called to report that the property looked undisturbed. The padlock on the base door of the silo was intact, and the farmhouse and outbuildings showed no sign of entry. A ladder truck would have been required to check the top hatch, and without an obvious crime in progress, he did not figure it warranted calling one out for what was probably a one-time thing. I agreed with him. I made a note in my duty log and moved on. For a while, I was genuinely satisfied with the vagrant explanation. It fit the evidence I had. Someone was camping in an empty silo on an abandoned farm in one of the most rural counties in Illinois. It happens. The Ohio river towns have a transient population that moves with the seasons, and the Renfro place was far enough from the county road that a person on foot could come and go without anyone noticing. The fact that I could not find physical evidence at the base of the structure did not trouble me much at that point. A dry November in southern Illinois hardens the clay ground to something close to ceramic. There was nothing to hold a print. What I turned over in my mind more than I wanted to admit was the exit time. 5:43 a.m. on October 12th. 5:38 a.m. on October 21st. Both of those timestamps are before astronomical twilight in southern Illinois in October. Full dark or close to it. A person sleeping in a silo and exiting before dawn would need to descend an exterior ladder in complete darkness without a light visible in either image. At a height of 38 feet, not impossible, but something a person does when they have done it many times and know the structure well enough to move on it without thinking. Then, I checked the card from October 21st. Same camera, same position, same field of view. The sequence triggered at 5:38 a.m., 9 days after the first one. This time, the subject was in the frame for longer. 12 seconds. The burst fired twice in sequence, which happens when a large subject continues to trigger the passive infrared sensor, giving me 11 frames instead of the standard 8. I noticed the descent speed first. In the October 12th sequence, the subject had moved off the hatch rim and down the exterior at a pace I had mentally filed as fast but not unusual, attributable to someone motivated to get down and away from the structure before full light. In the October 21st sequence, I had more frames and a longer window to observe, and the speed was faster than I would have expected from a person descending an exterior ladder, not falling, moving. I also noticed what the subject was wearing, or what I could assess about it. At 160 feet in IR, in the transition from pre-dawn dark to overcast gray, I could not differentiate between dark clothing and bare skin. The coloring was consistent across both events, which at minimum suggested the same individual. There was no coat or jacket visible, which I thought was notable given that October 21st in Pope County was 41 degrees Fahrenheit at 5:30 in the morning. I measured the subject against the silo diameter, 14 feet across at the widest point of the tank. A cutback attack IR at 160 feet has enough resolution to read the rings on a whitetail rack, and I had a bright overcast transitioning from full dark. Its head cleared the hatch opening at the top of the 38-foot silo by a measurable amount, and its feet were visible in frames 3 and 4 before it moved into the safety cage zone. Working from those reference points against the known diameter, I estimated the subject at 6 feet 1 to 6 feet 4. That put it well within the range of a large adult male. Nothing anomalous about the height itself. I called Beckett a second time. He was patient about it and said he would document it. With limited resources and a heavy caseload, Beckett noted that without a clear crime and without a formal trespass complaint from whoever controlled the property, there was not much the office could do. His suggestion was to contact the estate attorney if I wanted something actionable. I called Gloria Marsh in Golconda. She was polite and overwhelmed. The Renfro probate had been slow-moving for 3 years due to a boundary dispute on the northeast parcel and some unpaid property taxes from the last 2 years of Harold's life. She said she would contact the nephew in St. Louis and send a letter to the property, which both of us understood would accomplish nothing practical. She asked whether I thought the structure was at risk of vandalism. I told her I did not think so. I walked the property on November 2nd. Not a formal investigation, just a foot check. I wanted to look at the silo base for any sign of habitation, food wrappers, sleeping material, anything that would tell me how someone was getting in and how long they had been there. The bottom access door on an old harvestor is a sheet metal panel that bolts from the inside when the silo is in use, and in a silo that has been abandoned for over a decade with a corroded unloader assembly, that panel is effectively sealed by the mechanism and by corrosion. I pushed on it and it did not give. I walked the perimeter and looked at the exterior. The mud at the base had dried out in the preceding dry week and was not giving me any footprints. I looked at the exterior ladder. The paint was gone from the rungs, surface rust on the steel tubes, but the welds and the mounting brackets looked solid. A person in reasonable physical shape could climb it without difficulty. I stood at the base and looked up at the hatch 38 feet above me. The sky was gray and flat. Then I went back to my truck. In November, I added a second camera. A Wild Game Innovations Terra 10, a compact unit I mounted to a cedar fence post about 6 feet off the ground on the west side of the property line, angled to cover the west face of the silo and the pasture ground between the silo and the dairy barn foundation. My intention was to catch any movement coming and going from the base of the silo, rather than just the exit behavior at the top. The November events ran on November 3rd, 9th, and 17th. All 3 triggered before dawn. All 3 in the 5:30 to 6 a.m. window. The Terra 10 on the west side produced nothing useful on any of those dates. Whatever was exiting the silo consistently moved east and north after coming down, away from the west camera's field of view. That was itself a piece of information, though I did not know what to do with it yet. The November 17th sequence is the one I come back to most often. The figure exited the hatch at 5:41 a.m. Standard routine as I had come to think of it. The hatch opens, the shape appears at the rim, and the subject descends. In this sequence I had 14 frames, because the sensor triggered twice. The first 11 frames were consistent with what I had seen before. Then in frames 12, 13, and 14, it stopped on the exterior of the silo, roughly 11 feet below the hatch rim, and it turned its head to the right. The turn was not toward the camera. The cutaback was positioned 160 feet to the southwest, and its head turned east, to its right relative to its orientation on the silo surface, not toward the lens. But a profile was visible for the first time, left side of the head, from the jawline to the crown. Visible in 3 consecutive frames. I have examined that image on every screen I have access to. Laptop, phone, the larger monitor I borrowed from the office equipment room, a color print at full resolution that I have had pinned to the wall above my desk at home since November. Before I describe what I saw in it, I want to be clear about what I did to try to explain it away. I increased the brightness and contrast to see whether the image was compressing the skull shape at that range, and in those lighting conditions. I pulled up reference images of adult male humans in profile at similar distances to see whether the cranial proportions I was reading were within the normal distribution. I considered whether the camera's IR illuminator at 160 feet was producing a field edge distortion that could elongate the neck or widen the back of the skull. I spent several hours on this over 2 evenings, and I could not make any of those explanations work. The image is not distorted in a way that affects only the subject, while leaving the silo panels behind it undistorted. The IR field at that range is not producing an edge effect that would selectively alter the profile of an upright subject. I was looking at what the camera captured. The profile does not match a human head. The jaw is present. The general oval outline of a head is present. But the cranial vault, The portion of the skull from the ear level upward has a different geometry than what a human head shows in profile. It is wider at the back, proportionately, than I would expect from a person viewed at that angle. The neck is longer than I would calculate for a person of that estimated height. Not dramatically so. Enough to be measurable when I use the known diameter of the silo panels as a scale reference. The ratio of neck length to head size does not match what I would observe in a 6'3" adult male. I sat with that image for a long time before I called anyone. I called Frank Eldridge, the district wildlife biologist at the Harrisburg office. Frank is 22 years with the Forest Service and a careful, methodical person who does not make statements he cannot support. I told him I had some unusual camera captures from a property on the forest boundary and asked him to come look. He drove out the following week, and I walked him through the full sequence on my laptop at my kitchen table. He asked the same questions I had already worked through myself. Could it be a black bear? Illinois does not have an established breeding black bear population. The Illinois DNR tracks dispersal events from the Missouri Ozarks population and from southern Indiana, where the numbers have been recovering, and there have been confirmed sightings in extreme southern Illinois counties in recent years. But a black bear in Pope County in 2022 would have been documented through DNR channels long before I found it on a camera. And a black bear does not exit a closed hatch at the top of a 38-foot steel silo using its forelimbs and then descend the exterior of the structure. I had already ruled this out, and Frank agreed quickly. He looked at the November 17th profile image for several minutes without saying anything. Then he said the neck looked wrong. Not as a dramatic statement, quiet and direct, the way he talks when he is reporting an observation. He said the neck looked wrong and the skull shape at the back looked wrong, and he did not have an explanation for it. Frank said he would forward the images to a colleague at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, a wildlife ecologist who had done research on unusual animal behavior documentation, to get her thoughts. What he also said, and what I appreciated, was that he was not going to tell me what I was or was not looking at. The images were real, and he could see what they showed, and he did not have an explanation, and he was going to find out if someone else did. I drove home that night on U.S. Route 45 South, through Elizabethtown, then down the river road past the old ferry landing at Cave in Rock, and I thought about Harold Renfro. What kind of man farms the same ground for 4 decades and never says anything to anyone? Whether there was anything to say, or whether he had noticed nothing out of the ordinary, or whether he had noticed things and decided that some things in a person's life did not need to be broadcast at the Elizabethtown feed store. Pope County is old ground. The Garden of the Gods rock formations west of Golconda are 800 million years old, geologically, give or take what the textbooks say. The Ohio River has been here longer than anything that has walked this part of the continent. There are stretches of the Shawnee timber, down in the Lusk Creek drainage and along the river bluffs, where you can walk for 3 hours and not hear a road or see a power line or encounter any sign that the county has 4,000 people in it at all. I have patrolled those stretches for 18 years and I am comfortable in them, and I am not a person who gets spooked by woods. What I felt on the drive home that November night was not spooked. It was something quieter than that, a recalibration. Whether he had ever noticed anything from that farm, whether the silo had been empty long enough for something to move in, or whether whatever this was had been there longer than that. Harold had lived on that ground for 40 years. He was a quiet man who kept to himself. By all accounts, he had not farmed the silo for over a decade. I did not sleep particularly well that week. In early December, I added a third camera, a Tacticam Reveal X Pro, which is a cellular model, meaning it sends a compressed preview image to a cloud account and notifies my phone when the sensor triggers. I remounted it in the black oak, 9 feet up this time, angled to give a cleaner view of the top of the silo from a slightly higher elevation. The coverage overlapped with the cutaback, but from above, which I hoped would give me better detail on whatever came through the hatch. The Tacticam triggered on December 3rd at 5:41 a.m. The notification came through to my phone at 5:41 a.m. and I was awake, which I had been for the better part of 2 hours. I had been lying in the dark in Elizabethtown for the past several nights, checking my phone at intervals I would not describe as healthy. I looked at the preview image that the Tacticam sends with the notification, and there was a shape at the top of the harvest store, emerging from the hatch the way it always did. I got dressed. I put my duty belt on, which I do not always do when I am driving off duty to check a non-emergency situation, and I drove to Hicks Branch Road. December 3rd in Pope County was 28 degrees Fahrenheit before dawn with a clear sky and no wind. I arrived at the Renfro fence line at 6:22 a.m., roughly 40 minutes past the trigger. The sky was light enough to see the property clearly. The harvest store stood in the pasture the way it always stood. No movement anywhere that I could see. I climbed through the fence gap and walked across the frost-covered pasture grass toward the silo. I was watching the tree line and the sky as I walked, and I did not see anything moving. 160 feet of open ground between the fence and the silo. I reached the base, the north face of the silo. The face pointing away from the exterior ladder, and the side I reached first, was covered in an even layer of frost. The frost was undisturbed, flat and uniform across the glass-fused to steel surface. I walked around to the south face, where the exterior ladder was, and I stopped. The frost on the south face was not undisturbed. From approximately 2 feet off the ground all the way up the exterior surface to where the safety cage began at 15 feet, and then continuing up the outside of the panels beside and beyond the ladder structure to the rim at 38 feet, there were handprints in the frost. Not smears from wind or moisture. Handprints. 5-fingered impressions pressed into the frost, distinct and repeating, in a vertical line going from the base of the silo to the top. They were not at ladder rung spacing. They were between the rungs, on the bare panel surface of the silo exterior, in the gaps between the ladder uprights, where there was nothing but smooth glass fused to steel. I am a federal law enforcement officer. Evidence documentation is something I have been trained in and have practiced for 20 years. I did not stand there in the cold waiting for a feeling to pass. I worked. I photographed the handprints at multiple angles with the Canon, with a ruler from my duty bag placed alongside for scale in each frame. I photographed the pattern from ground level looking up, showing the prints tracking up the exterior panels in a line that bore no relationship to the spacing of the ladder rungs. I photographed the base of the structure and the ground, which was frozen hard and not going to give me compression prints, but which I documented anyway. I counted the visible handprints from the ground to the top of the safety cage. 17 prints on the left side of the ladder uprights, 14 on the right side. The prints were consistent in size throughout, though the frost was thinner higher up, and the definition was less clear above 20 feet. Consistent spacing, roughly 20 to 22 inches between prints in the vertical line. That consistency pointed to something moving on that surface without hesitation, covering the same reach and the same interval each time, the way a person navigates a familiar staircase in the dark, without looking at their feet. Then I stood in the December cold and looked at what I was looking at. I measure my own hand. 4.5 inches at the widest point of the palm. A large man, a 6'4" man who works construction or heavy labor, might measure 4.25 to 4.5 inches. I have used my hand as a field measurement tool for years, and I know what 4.5 inches looks like pressed flat against a surface. The handprints in the frost on the south face of the Renfro harvest store measured 9 inches wide at the palm. I used the channel seam between 2 GFS panels as a fixed reference. The seam width was consistent with factory specifications for a 1,974 14-foot harvest store. The handprints were 9 inches wide, and they were not at the spacing of a person using the exterior ladder. They were between the ladder rungs, on the smooth panel surface between the uprights, going straight up the exterior of a 38-foot steel silo. I stood at the base of the Renfro harvest store in the December cold with the documentation finished, and I thought about what I needed to do next. I thought about the duty log entry I was going to have to write. I thought about the imaging Frank Eldridge's contact at SIUC might be able to do with the photographs. I thought about whether there was a precedent in the Shawnee National Forest incident records, which go back to the 1940s, for anything that resembled this. Then I got in my truck and sat there for about 15 minutes before I drove back to Elizabethtown. Whatever had been inside the harvest store was not using the ladder to come down. I drove back to the property at noon on December 3rd with a fresh card in the cutaback and my duty camera and the ruler. The frost had melted off by then. The handprints on the south face of the harvest store were gone with it, which I had expected. All I had were the photographs. I documented the scene at midday for contrast, got measurements of the silo base diameter and exterior panel dimensions to calibrate my photographs from the morning, and drove back to Harrisburg. I filed a formal incident report that afternoon, case number SHWRLEI 202211103. I described the camera captures, the timeline of events, the physical evidence at the silo base, and my measurements. I categorized it as unauthorized use of private property adjacent to national forest land, pending further investigation. I sent copies to the district ranger, to the regional LEI coordinator in Milwaukee, and to the Pope County Sheriff's Office for their file. I also called Frank Eldridge and told him about the handprints. He was quiet a moment, and then he said to send him the photographs. I sent them that evening. Frank forwarded everything to his contact at SIUC, a wildlife ecologist named Dr. Sarah Okonkwo in the College of Agricultural Sciences at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. She had done field research on large mammal behavior documentation in the Shawnee Timber Corridor. Frank said she had looked at the November 17th image previously and had questions but had been cautious about drawing conclusions from a single long-range camera capture. The handprint photographs were different. She called me directly on December 7th. Dr. Okonkwo asked me a series of technical questions about the frost conditions, the ambient temperature at the time I found the prints, the approximate elapsed time between the camera trigger at 5:41 and my arrival at 6:22. She asked about the panel surface material and whether frost accumulation on glass fused to steel was consistent with what I had photographed, which it was. She asked about my measurement methodology, and I walked her through the ruler placement in each photograph. Then she told me that the palm width in the images was outside the range she was aware of for any documented North American primate, which included humans. She was precise about this. She said that the largest documented hand width for a human male in the medical literature, which is an extreme outlier case and not a realistic operational comparison, runs to about 5.5 inches at the palm. The prints in my photographs measured 9 inches. She said that the disparity was not in the range of measurement error or environmental distortion, noting that 60% was not a margin attributable to field conditions. What she also said, which I want to quote as accurately as I can because it has stayed with me, she said that the print placement was arguably more concerning than the print size. She said that an animal leaving handprints between ladder rungs on the smooth surface of a vertical steel silo was demonstrating a grip architecture, her phrase, that was not consistent with the forelimb anatomy of any large North American mammal she knew of. Bears have curved claws and broad paws suited for digging in tree bark. Great apes, the relevant primate comparison, are not native to North America, and their hand width falls well short of 9 inches regardless. Her assessment was that the prints, if taken at face value, described an animal with both the hand size and the hand geometry to grip a smooth steel surface with enough friction to support its weight at height. She said that while she could not make a firm identification from the photographs alone, the measurements I had recorded were inconsistent with a human subject. The placement of the prints between the ladder rungs rather than on the rungs themselves was, she noted, consistent with an animal that was gripping the panel surface directly rather than using a constructed climbing aid. She would like to come to the site, she said, if there was a way to arrange access. I contacted Gloria Marsh and requested access to the Renfro property for a federal wildlife investigation. She agreed and sent a letter of authorization. Dr. Okonkwo drove out from Carbondale on December 15th. Okonkwo spent 2 hours on the property, walking the perimeter of the silo, examining the exterior ladder and the panel surface with a headlamp and a magnifier, and taking her own measurements of the panel seam rails that ran vertically up the exterior of the harvestor at intervals of roughly 40 inches. The search was for grip traces in the frost residue on the panels, which was not productive since 12 days had passed, and the weather had cycled through rain and thaw in that time. She found nothing new physically. What she found that day, beyond the measurement confirmation, was something I had not fully considered. She noted that the exterior ladder had no wear pattern on the side surfaces of its rungs, consistent with repeated use by a large, heavy animal. The galvanized steel rungs were worn on their upper edges the way ladder rungs get worn when something grips them. but the wear was old, from Harold's use over the years, not fresh. Whatever had been descending that silo exterior was not touching the ladder at all, not gripping the rungs to steady itself, not using the cage uprights as handholds. It was going straight down the panel surface beside the ladder as if the ladder did not exist. What she did confirm, standing at the base of the silo and looking up at the exterior ladder structure, was that the panel seam rails between the ladder uprights were the only feature on the exterior surface that would offer any purchase for an animal trying to grip the smooth GFS panels. The seam rails are sheet metal ridges, approximately 3/8 of an inch wide and 1/4 inch proud of the panel surface. She said that an animal gripping those seam rails with hands 9 inches wide would need a grip strength and a hand geometry that she did not have a reference for in any North American species. Okonkwo told me she was going to write it up as an unclassified wildlife observation and submit it to the USFS Regional Forester's Office in Milwaukee through Frank's chain. She said she would keep her conclusions narrow, describing the subject as unidentified, the species affiliation as unknown, and the physical evidence as not consistent with any cataloged North American animal. She was careful, and I respected that. In the meantime, the Tacticam Reveal X Pro kept sending me notifications. December 6th at 5:39 a.m., the 11th at 5:44 a.m., the 19th at 5:37 a.m. Each time the preview image showed the shape at the top of the harvest door. Each time I was awake when the notification came, because by then I had stopped sleeping through the 5 a.m. hour. I had started charting the exit times on a sheet of graph paper I kept in the truck. What I noticed in December, and confirmed by going back through the October and November timestamps, was that the exit events were occurring in a consistent window between 5:30 and 5:50 a.m., regardless of date. In October, sunrise in Pope County was around 7 a.m. In December, it was closer to 7:25. The window of astronomical twilight and the timing of civil sunrise had shifted by more than 20 minutes across the span of my observations. The exit times had not shifted by more than 14 minutes across all documented events, and the average was clustered within an 8-minute band around 5:40. This was not behavior tied to the sunrise. Whatever was determining when this thing exited the silo was not the light level. It was something else, some internal mechanism I had no framework for. I showed this chart to Beckett when I talked to him in December about arranging a formal site inspection. He looked at it for a while and said he thought it was interesting, then added that without something actionable, the sheriff's office was limited in what it could authorize short of an extended surveillance operation, which they did not have the manpower for. I sat with the chart showing the consistent 5:30 to 5:50 a.m. exit window for a long time. I had been framing this as a trespass investigation from the start, in part because that framing gave it a category, gave me a box to put it in, and a procedure to follow. Trespass on private property, unknown subject, camera documentation, coordinate with county law enforcement, refer to a state representative. Every step in that procedure I had followed. None of it had produced anything that moved me closer to an explanation. What I had produced instead was a documented case of an unidentified large subject exiting a locked grain silo via the top hatch before dawn, over 14 consecutive events, with hand-width measurements outside the range of any known North American species, a canine refusal to approach the structure at 40 feet, and a behavioral pattern that did not correspond to any crepuscular or nocturnal wildlife behavior I had training in or reference for. I reached that formulation somewhere in the second week of January, and I wrote it in my duty log in those terms, because a duty log is the place where I keep what I actually think, rather than what I think will be understood. In January, I contacted the Illinois State Police District 13 about a K-9 unit visit to the property. I framed it as a potential missing persons check, which was not entirely inaccurate since I had a consistent human-scale subject on camera over a 3-month period, and had not been able to identify it. The District 13 lieutenant I spoke with was skeptical but cooperative. 2 troopers and a German shepherd named Comet came out to the Renfro property on January 5th. Comet would not approach the base of the harvest door. The handler, a trooper named Feld, whose certification I verified, spent about 20 minutes attempting to direct the dog toward the silo exterior. Comet worked the fence line and the pasture without issue, quartered the area around the farmhouse and outbuildings, and had no visible reaction to anything in the open ground. When the handler began moving toward the silo, the dog stopped at approximately 40 feet from the base and would not move forward regardless of the command. The handler walked to the silo himself and back, tried again, and Comet held at 40 feet. On the third approach, the dog sat down and refused to move at all. The trooper documented it as a handler-dog communication issue and included it in the incident notes. Off the record, he told me he had worked Comet for 6 years and had not seen the dog refuse a search location in that way. Comet was certified in both narcotics detection and tracking, and the dog's standard response to unknown scent was nose-down working behavior, not a static sit. The trooper said that when Comet sat down at 40 feet from the silo base, the dog's ears were forward, its posture was alert, and its attention was fixed on the silo exterior. He said it looked like a dog watching something he could not see. I asked him whether that was something he had experienced with a working dog before. He said no. I walked with him to the base of the silo after the formal search portion of the visit and stood there while he looked at the exterior ladder and the panel surface. He asked about the handprints. I showed him the photographs on my phone. He looked at them without comment for about 30 seconds and then handed the phone back. He asked me what I thought it was. I told him I did not have an answer. He said that was the right answer and that he was going to write up what the dog did and that it would go into the file. In his assessment, Comet was not showing aggression or fear response in the conventional sense. The dog looked, the trooper said, like a dog that had decided something was not worth investigating. January 9th, 5:47 a.m. The Tacticam notification came in and I was sitting in my truck on Hicks Branch Road. I had been there since 2 a.m. I had driven out after midnight with a thermos of coffee and a Vortex Diamondback HD 8x42 binoculars that I keep in the truck for field work, and I had parked at the end of the road with the lights off and watched the harvestor through the windshield. I had the engine cycling on and off for heat. The duty log was on my knee, and I was writing everything I intended to observe and document. The ProTac was in my coat pocket, and the binoculars were on the dash. I had written in the duty log that I intended direct observation of the structure exterior, notation of any departure event, with timestamp. What I had not written down was why I kept coming back to this piece of ground. I am a law enforcement officer, and I have a case file, and the case file gives me a professional rationale for continuing to investigate. But I was also honest enough with myself, sitting in the cold cab at 3 a.m. on Hicks Branch Road, to know that I was here because I needed to see it for myself. Not on a camera, not in a photograph. I needed to be present when it happened, whatever it was, and I needed to look at it with my eyes and with the binoculars and reconcile what I saw with the 3 months of documentation I had built up in the case file. I was also aware of what I was doing, a federal officer alone on a rural road in the dark watching a grain silo, and that awareness kept me methodical. The first 4 hours of the stakeout produced nothing. The harvestor stood in the dark against the slightly lighter sky the way it always did. No movement at the top. No movement at the base. At 4:30, I walked the fence line to keep my circulation up, staying on the road side of the fence and using the binoculars every few minutes to check the silo profile. Nothing. At 5 a.m., I climbed back in the truck and checked the Tacticam notification app. No trigger yet. At 5:15, I finished the last of the coffee and put the cup on the floor, and picked up the binoculars and watched the silo from the cab. The temperature was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. I had the engine running on low heat. I had been awake since before midnight. At 5:47, the top hatch opened. I could see it from the road, 300 feet away. The hatch swinging outward in the early morning dark against the slightly lighter sky. I put the binoculars up. The shape came over the rim of the hatch the way it always did in the camera footage, leading with what I now read clearly as its upper body, something pulling itself up and over the edge with its arms. In the binoculars at 300 feet in the pre-dawn, I had better detail than any of the camera captures, but less than I wanted. I could see that it was large, that it was moving with deliberate sureness that comes from familiarity with a surface, and that it was not using the exterior ladder. It went down the south face of the harvestor the way a person might descend a rock face toward the surface, hands finding purchase in the panel seam rails that ran vertically at 40-inch intervals. It moved faster than a person would, not dramatically faster. Enough that when I tried to estimate the descent rate against the known height of the silo, the math did not work for a human climbing down in a safe and controlled way. It was covering the distance too quickly. At 30 feet above the ground, it paused. For maybe 4 seconds, it stopped on the exterior of the silo and was still. I got out of the truck. I did not plan this. It was not what I had decided to do when I drove out there in the dark. But I got out of the truck and I took 3 steps into the road, which meant I was no longer behind glass and no longer behind the engine noise. And I think that is what it heard. It turned its head and looked in my direction. I had my Streamlight ProTac HLX in my left hand, which I carry on my duty belt and had transferred to my coat pocket for the stakeout. It is a high-lumen handheld that I use for night investigations. I turned it on, and I directed the beam at the silo. The beam reached. The distance was about 280 feet at that point, which is within the rated range of the ProTac at full output. For approximately 2 seconds, maybe a little more, I had the beam on the subject on the side of the harvestor, and it was looking in my direction. Then it moved, down and away, off the south face of the silo, and into the shadow cast by the dairy barn foundation, 30 feet to the east. I tracked the beam, but the barn shadow is 12 feet deep and I lost it in 3 seconds. I stood on Hicks Branch Road for a while after that. I am going to describe what the beam showed me because it is the core of what I am still working through. I want to be accurate and I want to be careful, which means I am going to use specific language and I am not going to overstate. The subject on the silo was large in the way that reads as presence, the sense you get when something is bigger than the space it occupies. The shape was upright, bilateral, 2 limbs in contact with the silo surface, and 2 extended slightly for balance, the way a climber holds their posture on a vertical face. The upper body and head, which were turned toward me, were visible for 2 seconds. The eyes caught the light. That is the first thing I want to say clearly. The eyes reflected the flashlight beam. Humans do not have eyeshine. We do not have the tapetum lucidum membrane behind the retina that gives deer and raccoons and cats their reflective glow in a flashlight. The subject on the south face of the Renfro harvestor had eyeshine. The color of the reflection was a pale amber gold, not the blue-green of a deer or the orange-red of a cat, a flat, warm gold that I have no reference point for in any animal I have encountered in 18 years of work in the Shawnee timber. The face itself. I had 2 seconds. The head was large, wider than a human head in proportion to the shoulders, and the structure of the face, from what I could see in the beam, was not right in the same way the November 17th camera profile was not right. The eyes were set wider than a human face. The nose and jaw area was foreshortened relative to the cranium. I cannot tell you more than that with confidence, because 2 seconds at 280 feet with a handheld flashlight is 2 seconds. The hands on the silo surface. The fingers were long. The grip on the panel seam rail was wrapped around the rail in a way that went beyond the rail itself. The fingers overlapping each other on the far side of the steel ridge, which would require a handspan considerably wider than the 3/8 of an inch rail width. I cannot give you a measurement from 2 seconds of observation. I can tell you that the grip looked wrong in the same way everything else about this had looked wrong for 3 months. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes after the subject disappeared into the shadow behind the dairy barn foundation. I did not hear it moving. I listened for maybe 5 minutes after I got back in the truck. The window cracked, the engine off, the frozen pasture, completely silent. There was no sound of footsteps in the frost, no branch movement in the timber at the west boundary, 200 feet beyond the silo. No sound at all that I could attribute to something moving away. Whatever I had seen on the silo exterior had moved into the shadow of the dairy barn foundation and had not made an audible sound after that. I thought about getting out of the truck and going to the dairy barn foundation. I had the ProTac and I had my service weapon and I had my radio. The dairy barn foundation is a concrete block wall, 3 sides standing at about 4 feet. The interior open to the sky since the barn roof caved in sometime in Harold's last years. It is a small enclosure. Going into it in the dark to look for something I did not have a category for was not something I could justify professionally. I did not go. I want to be honest about that because honesty is the only thing that makes this account worth anything. I sat in the truck and I wrote in the duty log, and after 20 minutes I drove back to Elizabethtown. There is something that changes when you shift from camera evidence to direct observation. A photograph of something you cannot explain is unsettling in an intellectual way. You can put it in a file, assign it a case number, send it to a colleague with questions. There is distance between you and the photograph. Standing on a county road at 12 degrees in the dark, watching something look at you from 30 feet up the side of a steel silo does not offer that distance. It offers nothing except what you saw. And what you saw does not leave when you start the truck and drive away. I had been a law enforcement officer for 18 years, and I had seen things in that time that I had eventually found a way to place in a category. I did not have a category for what I saw on January 9th. The formal incident report I filed for January 9th is 11 pages. I wrote it over 2 days, and I reviewed every word before I submitted it. I am a careful person, and I write careful reports, and I was more careful on that one than I have ever been on anything in my career, because I knew what it said, and I did not want a single word of it to be imprecise. The regional LEI coordinator in Milwaukee acknowledged receipt and said it would be reviewed. A wildlife biologist with the USFS regional office followed up with Dr. Okonkwo directly. I do not know what came of that conversation. In late January and early February, the Tacticam continued to trigger. 5 events in that window, all in the same time band, all showing the subject exiting the hatch and descending. I was not driving out there anymore to intercept it. I had made a professional decision, in consultation with the district ranger, that without a formal joint operation with state resources, a solo officer approaching an unidentified large subject in the dark on private property at 4 degrees Fahrenheit was not sound procedure. I watched the phone notifications come in, logged each one, and updated the incident file. On February 22nd, I drove Hicks Branch Road on my way back from a meeting with the Pope County Conservation District in Golconda. It was a bright, cold afternoon, temperature around 25. The silo visible from the road, the way it always was. A landmark I had been using as an orientation point for my entire time patrolling this district. The silo was not there. I stopped the truck and looked at the property for about 30 seconds before I got out. The farmhouse was standing. The dairy barn foundation was there. The old machinery shed was there. The concrete base ring that the harvestor sat on for 48 years was still there, a circular pad of concrete about 16 feet across, pale and slightly raised above the frost-burned pasture grass. The harvestor was gone. The exterior ladder was gone. No debris, no panel sections, no fasteners in the grass around the base. The area around the concrete pad had been cleared cleanly. No tire tracks in the frozen ground at the base ring that I could detect. No cut marks on the pad's surface from demolition equipment. The structure had been removed, and the site had been cleaned up, and I had driven this road in the last 6 days and had not seen any equipment or vehicles on the Renfro property. I called Gloria Marsh the same afternoon. She had no knowledge of any demolition or removal activity on the property. No contractor had contacted her office. The estate had not authorized any structural work. She was going to check with the nephew. The nephew, contacted through her office, said he had not hired anyone and had not been aware of any plans to remove the silo. He asked if it had fallen down. I filed a separate report about the structure removal. I contacted the Pope County Building Department, which in a county of 4,000 people is a one-person office in the courthouse annex, and confirmed that no demolition permit had been filed for the Renfro property at any point in the preceding 12 months. The Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, which tracks asbestos-containing material in old agricultural structures, had no record of a notification filing for the site, which is required before any demolition of structures built before 1980. The harvestor was built in 1974. No IEPA notification on record. I checked County Road Commission records for any oversized load permits, which would be required to move large steel sections on county roads. None on file. I checked with the Illinois Department of Transportation for permit records on Illinois Route 146 and U.S. Route 45, both of which you would have to use to move a silo off the Renfro property if you were hauling it anywhere of significance. Nothing in the relevant time frame. I contacted the 2 steel recycling operations within 60 miles, one in Harrisburg and one in Marion, and asked whether they had received a quantity of glass-fused to steel agricultural silo material in the preceding 4 weeks. Neither had. A harvestor silo 14 feet in diameter and 38 feet tall weighs approximately 16,000 pounds in the panels and structural hardware alone, not counting the base structure. Moving it requires a crane, steel cutting equipment, and flatbed transport. That kind of operation does not pass through without leaving traces on frozen county gravel roads in February. I walked the approach road and the property access and found no sign of heavy equipment movement. The frozen ground was not disturbed in a way consistent with crane operation or flatbed vehicle access. I have not been able to determine who removed the silo, how it was done, or where the material went. I have driven that road 61 times since February 22nd, in daylight and in the dark, with the binoculars in my lap and the ProTac on the seat. The concrete base ring of the harvestor is still there. The pasture around it is recovering the way ground recovers when a structure is removed and left alone. Nothing has returned to the base ring. No footprints in the mud in spring, no disturbance in the summer growth, no camera captures on the cutaback and the Terra 10 that I have kept running on the fence line. The Tacticam stopped sending notifications on February 15th at 5:43 a.m. The preview image showed the hatch opening at the top of the silo, the shape coming over the rim, the beginning of the familiar descent down the south face. That was 1 week before I drove past and found the structure gone. I have 93 images in the Renfro file across all 3 cameras. Of those 93, 67 contain the subject in some form, ranging from the initial long-range captures in October to the higher elevation Tacticam images from December and January. In all 67 images, the subject is presented from behind, from above, or in right-side profile. There is not a single front-facing image in the sequence. Not one capture of the subject looking directly into a lens. I have thought about what that means. It is possible this is a coincidence of camera placement and behavior patterns. It is equally possible the subject was aware of the camera locations and consistently oriented itself to avoid direct capture, which would imply a level of environmental awareness I do not have a framework for in either a human or animal subject. What else might explain it, I cannot say. A law enforcement officer has a formal obligation to pursue a case until it is closed or referred. Case SHWRLEI 202-21103 is listed in my active files as open and unresolved. The regional coordinator in Milwaukee has it in their system. Dr. Okonkwo's unclassified wildlife observation report is attached. The K9 response documentation from January 5th is attached. The January 9th field incident report is attached. I still patrol Hicks Branch Road. I still have the cameras running. I still check the image files every time I pull a card. The way you check something you know is not going to change but cannot stop yourself from checking anyway. The concrete base ring of the Renfro harvestor is still there. It will probably be there for a long time. Concrete poured in the 1970s does not go anywhere on its own. The structure that sat on it has been gone since February and I do not know where it went or what took it. Pope County is old ground. The Shawnee has been forest in some form for longer than any record I have access to. I have worked this timber for 18 years and thought I knew it. I thought that until October of 2022. The Garden of the Gods, 6 miles northwest of the Renfro property, has formations geologists place in the Pennsylvanian era, 300 million years old. Laid down when the interior of North America was a shallow tropical sea, 60 million years before the first dinosaur. I have stood on Camel Rock and looked southeast over the timber and the farm ground and the river corridor and the Ohio beyond it for nearly 40 years now. Whatever was in the Renfro harvestor, whatever used that 48-year-old steel structure in a county where almost nobody goes, it was here before the silo, and it is still here. In the timber along the west boundary of the Renfro property, or somewhere along the Ohio River corridor, or in one of the limestone drainage hollows in the Lusk Creek wilderness that I have walked 100 times and thought I knew, I am still here. The cameras are still running, the case is still open,